Greetings, true believers, and welcome to another mighty episode of History of the Marvel Universe. This channel is brought to you in part by Patreon supporters. If you would like to vote in monthly polls and get your name the special thanks at the end of each episode, you can sign up for as little as $1 per month over at patreon.com/MaryMarvelite. The link is in the description below. This week, we're talking about a woman named Jane Foster. As a young girl, Jane did not grow up in a religious household, but her mother found herself regretting this somewhat as she slowly died of cancer. When Jane was 9 years old, her mother told her to find a god that she could believe in, one that was worthy of her. However, Jane didn't end up going to church and she did not believe in any gods. Instead, she pursued science and medicine and became a registered nurse. She was hired by a doctor named Donald Blake and assisted him at his private practice. The two grew close, and over time, Blake began to develop feelings for Jane. She also cared about him and was protective of him in part due to his reliance on his walking cane. It was also during this time that Jane's father passed away following a heart attack. And while she may not have found God in the way her mother intended, Jane did see one while joining Dr. Blake on a humanitarian mission to a war-torn South American nation. When their ship was attacked by forces sent by the brutal dictator known as the Executioner, the enemy planes were defeated by the mythical god of thunder, Thor. Blake supposedly did not witness this, as he claimed to have fallen overboard when the planes attacked. Jane got an even closer look at the Norse god when he saved her from being captured by the Executioner. She was smitten with her savior, but secretly found herself wishing that Donald Blake was more like Thor. However, Blake had a knack for disappearing whenever trouble was afoot. However, this was because Donald Blake and Thor were actually one and the same. You see, years prior to this, in order to teach his son humility, the Allfather, Odin, stripped Thor of his godly power and sent him to Earth in mortal form. The human identity of Donald Blake was based on a young medical student named Keith Kincaid, but altered as to not be completely identical. And so Blake followed a similar path as Kincaid, leading to him becoming a doctor and meeting Jane Foster. Meanwhile, Odin had placed an enchantment on the mighty hammer Mjolnir, marked by the following inscription: "Whosoever holds this hammer, if he be worthy, shall possess the power of Thor." And when the time was right, Blake reclaimed his true identity and gained the ability to change back and forth between mortal and god. However, during this time he was also limited by the fact that he would change back into Donald Blake if separated from the hammer for more than 60 seconds. And of course, his dual identity would sometimes place Jane into danger, like when his brother Loki used her as bait to lure Thor into a trap. Jane remained unaware that Thor and Blake were one and the same for some time, during which, while she was attracted to Thor, she found herself wishing that Blake would be the one to romance her. It should also be noted that during this time, Thor's sense of identity was somewhat skewed, often thinking of himself as Donald Blake first, as he was convinced that Jane would never love a lame man such as he. And when he resolved to tell Jane his secret identity, Odin forbade Blake from revealing his true nature to any mortal. And so things continued like that for several months, with Jane growing less and less patient over Blake's inability to speak his mind. She could tell that there was something he was keeping from her and that he was always on the edge of telling her but would never actually say it. Furthermore, there were times in which Blake's duties as Thor would keep him away from the office for extended periods of time, causing some of his patients to leave and his business to suffer. Jane eventually left Blake's practice and briefly worked for Dr. Basil Andrews. However, when a super criminal called the Cobra broke into his office to steal chemicals, Jane was thoroughly unimpressed by how easily Andrews kowtowed to the villain's demands. During that ordeal, Jane risked her own life to summon Thor so that the Cobra could be defeated. After that, she returned to Blake's employ, hoping the two could sort out their feelings for one another. Meanwhile, Thor continued to petition his father for the right to pursue a relationship with Jane. Eventually, Odin agreed to make Jane an immortal herself if she proved worthy of it. However, shortly after that, Jane interfered in a battle between Thor and the villainous Mr. Hyde. Mind you, this was because Jane had witnessed Hyde capture Blake and lock him in a room with a time bomb that only he could disarm. And so she believed that if Hyde was captured or killed, then Donald Blake was doomed. Regardless of her intention, Odin used this as an excuse to preclude Jane from becoming a goddess. Furthermore, Loki was able to convince Odin to take further steps to separate Jane and Thor. He dispatched another Asgardian, Amora the Enchantress, to seduce Donald Blake. However, Blake recognized Amora, and this plot ultimately failed. And sometime later, Jane admitted to Thor that she was in love with Donald Blake. Their relationship subsequently grew into a romance, but of course Blake's duties as Thor still pulled him away. Jane was often put into harm's way by those who knew of her connection to Thor, and Blake's attempts to reveal his true identity were thwarted by Odin. After many months of this, things finally came to a head when Jane was hospitalized after being abducted by a reporter who plotted to blackmail Thor. By this point, she could no longer tolerate Blake's prolonged, unexplained disappearances. And so Donald Blake defied his father's orders and revealed that he was in fact the mighty Thor. From there, Jane's life would only continue to grow even stranger. She met and befriended the Olympian demigod Hercules, an old rival of Thor's. After Herc defeated Thor in combat, in part because Odin had weakened his own son, Odin was remorseful and sent Jane to comfort Thor, recognizing their feelings for one another as genuine. After that, Jane's roommate, Tana Nile, turned out to be an alien colonizer from the Rigelian Empire. When the alien woman hypnotically compelled Jane to leave the country, she traveled to the Balkan nation of Transia. There, she was recruited by agents of the High Evolutionary to tutor his race of anthropomorphic animals, the New Men. However, one of the evolutionary's experiments produced a viciously evil creature known as the Man-Beast. After the Man-Beast was defeated by Thor, the High Evolutionary and the New Men took to the stars. Finally, after that, Jane Foster crossed the Rainbow Bridge to Thor's fabled home of Asgard itself. There, Odin transformed her into a goddess with the power of flight. However, the king of Asgard then tested Jane's courage by pitting her against a lord of fear known as the Lurking Unknown. Jane, it seems, was not ready for such a task and had to be rescued by Thor. She begged Odin to make her human once again and return her to Earth. Odin agreed despite Thor's protestations and declared that Jane Foster had more wisdom than his own son in this matter. Jane's memories of Asgard were suppressed, and after returning to Earth, she began working for Dr. Keith Kincaid. As mentioned earlier, Kincaid was in fact the mortal on whom Donald Blake was based. Thor, meanwhile, reunited with his former love, the Lady Sif, and soon their romance was rekindled. And so time moved on with Jane no longer involved with Donald Blake or Thor. However, at one point she was kidnapped by an insane billionaire who wanted to transfer his mind into Thor's body. Around this time she was dating a doctor named Jim North, but this doesn't seem to have been a lasting relationship. However, she did grow close with Dr. Kincaid and they were eventually engaged. However, her life would change again when another Fear Lord, the Dweller in Darkness, began spreading terror across Manhattan. Innocent people were compelled towards self-harm and many attempted to take their own lives. Jane was one such victim, and while she survived, she was hospitalized once again. Thor quickly went to visit her upon learning this, and Sif could tell that he still deeply cared for the mortal woman. And so, with the aid of Hercules, Sif obtained a cosmic rune staff from Camotharn, the Elder of the Universe known as the Possessor. Sif then used the rune staff to revive Jane by infusing the mortal woman with her own life energy. Jane awakened and even regained her full memories, but Sif had disappeared. Jane Foster and Donald Blake were a duo once more, but this time things would be different. This time, when Jane was abducted by trolls, she freed herself and captured the Troll King Garadur. It seems that after being infused with Sif's spirit, Jane inherited the goddess's vitality and combat prowess. Furthermore, now that she was fully aware of his life as Thor, Jane supported and encouraged her lover in his endeavors. She was no longer simply a damsel in distress and would often leap into the action herself. She accompanied Thor to the realm of the Ennead, the Egyptian gods, and she joined him on a journey to the future where they battled the villainous Time Twisters, the dark creations of a being known as He Who Remains. In fact, when they traveled to the Citadel at the end of time, it was Jane Foster who convinced He Who Remains to terminate the Time Twisters before they were created, thus saving their entire timeline. And if you want to know more about the Time Twisters and He Who Remains, I go into a lot more detail in my video about the Timekeepers and the TVA, so I'll link that in the description below. Jane then helped Thor combat the revolutionary forces of El Lobo in the war-torn nation of Costa Verde. When Thor and the cosmic hero Firelord were placed under hypnotic control by a woman named Carmen Escudero, it was Jane who defeated Escudero and freed the two heroes. Thor suspected that Jane's more adventurous attitude was due to Sif's spirit inhabiting her and affecting her personality. However, it's entirely possible that Jane's newfound fighting spirit was simply the result of her increased skill and stamina, allowing her to be more daring. When Jane returned to Asgard, the Asgardian Grand Vizier presented her with Lady Sif's enchanted sword. However, the sword's magic caused Jane to disappear and be replaced by Sif. Thor assumed that the two women had been fused into one being, but the truth was a bit more complicated. When Sif used the rune staff to revive Jane while her spirit joined with the mortal woman, her physical body fell into a pocket dimension within the staff. When Jane took hold of Sif's enchanted sword, the Asgardian warrior was summoned forth, but Jane took her place in the rune staff. It was initially theorized that Sif could change back into Jane by returning to Earth, but this ultimately proved not to be the case. And besides, Sif resided on Asgard for months after that, having no desire to accompany Thor to Earth. It was proven that Jane Foster wasn't lost forever during an adventure in the Dark Dimension. A sorceress named Umar, the sister of the dread Dormammu, attempted to mystically strip Sif of her very identity. However, the spell caused Sif to change places with Jane, which ultimately saved her. Jane and Thor escaped back to Earth, but Jane's return proved temporary and she soon changed back into Sif. Sif confirmed that it was not her own fighting spirit that saved them, but Jane Foster's natural strength and courage. Eventually, Sif agreed to join her beloved Thor in his life on Earth. She initially felt out of place, much like Jane did in Asgard, and it took some time for her to adjust. Additionally, Sif didn't much care for Thor's mortal persona of Donald Blake. But for the next part of our tale, we must turn our attention back to Dr. Keith Kincaid. He was the man who Odin used as a template to create Donald Blake. He was the doctor who Jane worked for after losing her memories of Asgard, and he was engaged to Jane shortly before the incident involving the Dweller in Darkness, which caused her to be hospitalized. And so when Jane was revived, regained her missing memories, and went adventuring with Thor, Keith Kincaid was left behind. From his point of view, his fiancée had disappeared from her hospital bed and never returned. Naturally, he began an investigation and discovered that Jane had been seen with her former employer, Donald Blake. Blake, of course, learned all of this when he was brought in for questioning. He later confided in Kincaid, revealing his dual identity and the fate of Jane Foster. Together, Thor, Sif, and Kincaid set out to reacquire the rune staff of Camo Tharn. On this quest, they discovered that the possessor had absorbed the souls of those trapped in the Runestaff dimension. Fortunately, Thor and Sif succeeded in freeing Jane and the other beings that were taken by Camo Thurn. Being separated from Sif had again left Jane's memories fuzzy and incomplete, but this time the memory loss proved to be temporary. As she recovered from her daze, she remembered Keith Kincaid, to whom she was betrothed. Thor and Sif brought the two mortals back to Earth and attended their wedding shortly thereafter. And not long after this, Thor abandoned his Donald Blake identity when Odin removed that enchantment from Mjolnir. For a time, Jane lived happily with Keith and even became pregnant with his child. The couple moved to Chicago and named their infant son Jimmy. However, they eventually separated when Keith returned to his Manhattan practice. Several years later, Jane and Jimmy were kidnapped by the villainous Man-Beast, now calling himself Carnivore, and brought back to Mount Wundagore in Transia. Thankfully, they were saved by Thor and his new allies, the God Pack, a team of godlike beings created by the High Evolutionary who had returned to Earth. During all of this, she also met a man who appeared to be Donald Blake, completely separate from Thor. However, it was soon discovered that this was merely a mystical construct created by Loki's wife, Sigyn. This raised the question of if there ever was a real mortal Donald Blake, but it's since been confirmed that the Don Blake persona was created by Odin for his son to inhabit. Jane, meanwhile, remained with the High Evolutionary for a time, helping to rehabilitate some of the evil new men who had been followers of the Man-Beast. However, during the Onslaught incident, Jane returned to New York to help treat victims of the psionic monster. She again reunited with Thor during this time, and the two performed emergency surgery on an injured father, saving his life. She stayed in Manhattan after that, attending medical school and becoming a doctor herself. She reunited with Keith Kincaid, and they began taking steps to renew their relationship. With her close ties to the superhero community, Jane became proficient in treating superhuman patients while working with the likes of the Heroes for Hire. She treated Tony Stark and learned that he was Iron Man before his identity was public knowledge, and even helped him redesign his armor when she found that the energy fields it was generating were actively damaging his body. This even led to her being the on-call doctor for the mighty Avengers. Meanwhile, Thor began using a new mortal guise, that of a paramedic named Jake Olson. In order to hide Thor from enemies known as the Dark Gods, Odin's servant Marnot transformed Thor into a copy of Jake Olson and forbade him from revealing his true identity to anyone. This time the human identity did in fact belong to a real mortal, but the real Jake Olson died during a battle between Thor and the Destroyer. Jane met Jake, secretly Thor, while working at Memorial Hospital in Manhattan, and quickly realized something was up. Having experienced this before, it didn't take her long to confirm her suspicions and confront Thor. She also learned that Jake was engaged to a woman named Hannah Fairmont and implored for Thor to tell Hannah the truth. Jane continued to be an ally to Thor, even helping him clear his name when it was discovered that the real Jake Olson had stolen drugs from the hospital before his death. When Jane was kidnapped by the Absorbing Man to treat his cancer-stricken wife, Titania, she eventually convinced him to surrender to the authorities so that Titania could be brought to the hospital. During that ordeal, while Jane was being taken, Keith was injured by the Absorbing Man and fell into a coma, but he eventually recovered. Jane also helped treat the Asgardian warrior Hogun when he was grievously injured in a battle against the Wrecking Crew, as well as Thor himself when he was badly burned while trapped in the form of Jake Olson. Thor and Jake were later separated into two distinct bodies, but they eventually merged together again to ensure that Thor retained his humanity and to prevent a dark future where Thor took over the Earth. But sometime after that, Thor, the Asgardians, and Asgard itself were all destroyed, consumed in the fires of Ragnarok as they battled the flaming giant Surtur, and Thor fell into a dimensional void. The very same void that Donald Blake had resided in ever since Odin had separated him from Thor. And so when Thor fell into that realm, Donald Blake was expelled back to Earth, where he found and reclaimed Mjolnir just as he did so many years ago. Thor and Blake were joined in a shared existence once again, able to switch back and forth with the hammer's enchantment. Using the power he'd inherited from his father, Thor resurrected the city of Asgard on Earth, leaving it floating outside the small town of Broxton in Oklahoma. Meanwhile, Jane's relationship with her husband began to fall apart yet again. This time they filed for divorce and Keith won custody of their son Jimmy. She was visited by Donald Blake, but their reunion was soured by the fact that the very first thing that he wanted to talk about was Sif. You see, while Asgard's capital city was recreated on Earth, the Asgardians themselves had been reborn in mortal forms. After finding them, Thor was able to restore them to their true godly stature, but he was unable to locate Sif's soul. And so he came to Jane, wondering if her previous connection to Sif had caused their spirits to reconnect after Ragnarok. However, Jane was upset that after so long, Blake was there for Sif and not for her. She of course understood that finding Sif was important, but was hurt nonetheless. She later returned to Blake and apologized for slapping him. She explained that she remembered exactly how it felt to have an Asgardian spirit bound to her own, and that Sif definitely wasn't with her anymore. In truth, Loki had trapped Sif in the body of a dying old woman named Rose Chambers. However, she was one of Jane's patients, and so it was Jane who found Sif. Jane contacted Donald Blake, and thus Thor arrived before Rose Chambers passed away, and Sif was restored to her proper Asgardian form. After that, Jane and Don had a proper reunion and renewed their friendship, if not their relationship. However, a terrible tragedy struck around this time as well. A car accident. Jane's ex-husband Keith had apparently fallen asleep at the wheel. Their son Jimmy was in the car at the time. Neither of them survived the crash, and this time there weren't any gods around to save them. Jane was of course devastated, but she moved on and later relocated to Broxton, Oklahoma. After Norman Osborn's Siege of Asgard left the area in ruins, Jane helped with the reconstruction by opening a new medical office with Donald Blake. During this time, she met a quantum cosmologist named Eric Solvang, not to be confused with Eric Selvig. However, Jane and Eric may have gotten off on the wrong foot somewhat literally, as when he first approached her, he gave off the wrong impression and Jane kicked him in the groin and maced him in self-defense. However, after she and Tony Stark, who was financing and aiding the reconstruction efforts, helped Eric warn the Asgardians about an impending threat called the World Eaters. During the subsequent invasion, Jane helped both locals and refugees from other realms find shelter in Broxton. And after that, she and Eric Solvang actually began dating for a brief time. Meanwhile, Thor was thought to have been killed in a battle with Odin's brother Kull, the god of fear. His weakened soul fell into a land between realms and fought to survive. At the same time, a trio of sorceresses cast a spell which made everyone, including Jane, forget that Thor ever existed, instead believing that Tanarus was the god of thunder. In truth, Tanarus was actually the troll Ulick who had been mystically transformed. But because of these circumstances, Donald Blake magically continued to exist as a completely separate entity from Thor. Blake continued working with Jane, but grew jealous and bitter over her relationship with Eric. After Thor returned and Tannerus was exposed as a falsehood, Donald Blake entered into an alliance with Amora the Enchantress, seeking to replace Thor himself, but this resulted in his own beheading. Becoming the one true god of thunder once again, Thor soon battled a foe known as Gorr, the God Butcher, an alien who believed that all gods were corrupt and unworthy. He wielded a weapon called the Necroblade, a sword that was forged by Null, the god of the symbiotes, the alien race which spawned Spider-Man villains like Venom and Carnage. However, Thor defeated the God Butcher with help from time-traveling duplicates of himself from the distant past and the far future. Meanwhile, Jane broke up with Eric and later started dating a real estate agent named Walter while running the Broxton clinic herself. However, she left her job after she, like her mother, was diagnosed with breast cancer. She started undergoing chemotherapy, and after Thor found out, he came to visit her. He offered to search for magical solutions, but Jane knew that magic always came with a price, and so she was determined to fight the cancer with science and medicine. And so instead, Thor took her to the blue area of the moon, a section with a breathable atmosphere, so she could watch a sunset from space. And her life would continue to change after Broxton was completely destroyed by the corrupt Roxxon Energy Corporation. After that happened, Jane accepted an offer from Thor to be Earth's representative on the Council of Worlds. The city of Asgardia, built after the Siege of Asgard, left the Earth but remained in the solar system. Around that time, Thor was also involved in a battle against the elderly super spy Nick Fury, who had absorbed cosmic secrets from Uatu the Watcher. During that battle, Fury was able to stop Thor by uttering 3 words. Gorr was right. Plagued with doubt, Thor believed those words, and that no gods were worthy. He himself became unworthy, unable to lift Mjolnir, and dropped his enchanted hammer on the blue area of the moon. There it sat, alone and immovable, still bearing its inscription, "Whosoever holds this hammer, if he be worthy, shall possess the power of Thor." While staying in the city of Asgardia, Jane Foster could hear the hammer calling to her. As a senator in the Council of Worlds, she had access to the Rainbow Bridge and used it to travel to the Earth's moon. Before placing her hand on the hammer, she uttered one phrase: "There must always be a Thor." As she laid her hands on the enchanted weapon, the inscription changed ever so slightly. "Whosoever holds this hammer, if she be worthy, shall possess the power of Thor." And thus did Dr. Jane Foster prove herself worthy of such power, as she did what the Odinson could not do at that time, lifting the hammer aloft and becoming the mighty Thor. Not only did the hammer change her, making her larger and giving her blonde hair, but it also endowed her with a metal mask, and she decided to conceal her identity. As Thor, Jane battled frost giants, dark elves, and the Roxxon Corporation's Minotaur CEO, Dario Agger. We don't exactly have time to go into detail about all of these exploits in this video, so I highly recommend reading Jason Aaron's Thor series from 2014 to 2015 and the Mighty Thor from 2016 to 2018 for the full story. We are going to be spoiling plot points from those series as well as the War of the Realms in the rest of this video, so if you'd like to read those for yourself, you should probably stop watching now. Thor, or rather Odinson, began searching for whoever had taken his hammer, but initially ruled out the often bedridden Jane Foster. He did eventually give the new Thor his blessing when he and an army of female warriors came to her aid after Odin sent the destroyer armor, piloted by his brother Kull, to attack her. However, Jane's use of the hammer came at a terrible cost. Every time she used it, it would burn the chemicals and drugs from her body, but leave the cancer as part of her human form. And so upon changing back into Jane Foster, she had effectively undone her chemotherapy treatments. Furthermore, she was bound by the same limit as when Donald Blake first became Thor, and would revert to mortal form after being separated from Mjolnir for 60 seconds. However, she continued to use the hammer to fight and was even one of the few survivors from Earth 616 to participate in the multiversal Secret Wars. Following that whole event and the restoration of the universes, some things fell into worlds from which they did not originate. One example of this was the Mjolnir from Earth 1610, the Ultimate Universe, which landed in the remnants of old Asgard in Reality 616, the Marvel Universe. After that, Jane, as Thor, joined the latest incarnation of the Avengers and romanced her teammate Sam Wilson, who at the time was operating as Captain America but is otherwise known as the Falcon. During a battle with Kang the Conqueror, Sam witnessed Thor change back into Jane Foster, and so he was one of the few people to learn her secret identity. She also clashed directly with Odin in Asgardia, who believed that she had somehow stolen the hammer unjustly. Her identity was nearly compromised when she was being investigated by S.H.I.E.L.D., but Mjolnir was able to conjure an illusion to make it seem as though Jane and Thor were in the same place at the same time. However, she did entrust her secret to Agent Roz Solomon, who was herself a friend and ally to the other Thor. In fact, when Jane was forced to step down from her senatorial duties because of her declining health, she selected Roz as her replacement on the Council of Worlds. And she did eventually tell Thor Odinson the truth about the new Thor. Speaking of the Odinson, he at one point went in search of the other Mjolnir, the one that had fallen through from the Ultimate Universe, but upon placing his hand on it, he recognized that this hammer was not his and decided to leave it. However, this other universe Mjolnir was later claimed by the Asgardian senator Volstagg the Voluminous, who was then transformed into the violent War Thor. Driven by the hammer, Volstagg launched an attack on the fiery denizens of Muspelheim, showing little concern for innocents caught in the crossfire, forcing Jane Foster to take up her own hammer to confront him. But in the end, it was not violence and hammers that stopped the War Thor, but Jane herself, who reverted to mortal form and convinced Volstagg to drop his weapon and stand down. However, he was forced to raise this hammer once again when Asgardia was attacked by the mighty Mangog, a terrifying creature born from the righteous fury of billions of murdered souls. Volstagg fought valiantly, but the Mangog crushed the hammer of the War Thor between his powerful claws. At the same time, Jane was forced to rest and recover as Odinson convinced her to lay down her hammer. She was examined by Dr. Strange, and he determined that her human body could not handle another transformation. If she changed once more into Thor, it would be the death of Jane Foster. And so she rested, she waited, and she left her friends to defend themselves. Until she couldn't. When Jane was a child, her mother had told her to find a god she could believe in. One that was worthy. When Jane actually met the gods, she found them to be people, friends, and in one very special case, much more. And they were being killed by an unstoppable monster. And so Jane Foster said no. She picked up the hammer one more time, became the goddess of thunder one more time, and proved that she was worthy one more time by taking Mjolnir and striking the Mangog square in the jaw. But that wasn't enough. In order to defeat the monster, she bound him in unbreakable dwarven chains with one end tied to her hammer and threw Mjolnir into the sun, dragging the Mangog with it and destroying them both. With the time she had left, she removed her helmet and showed Thor Odinson the face beneath the mask, the face of a goddess. As the city of Asgardia burned around them, the two gods shared what was sure to be their final kiss. The next thing Jane knew, she was in front of the gates of Valhalla, the land of the honored dead. Odin arrived to greet her, and even he, through all his anger, admitted that Jane, a mortal woman, had saved his people, his family, and earned her eternal reward. But, for the second time that day, Jane said no. She wasn't ready to die, and her story isn't over yet. And so Thor and Odin worked together to channel the power of the god Tempest that had once dwelt within Mjolnir, and used it in a desperate attempt to revive Jane Foster one more time, to pull her back from the brink of death and give her another chance at life. And miraculously, it worked. And so Jane retired from the world of gods and superheroics, at least for a time, and focused on healing. And with thunder echoing in her veins, her recovery went well. For a while it was difficult for her to adjust, but her spirits were lifted when she was visited by Thor's time-traveling granddaughters from the far future, who respected and revered her. And after enough time of uninterrupted treatment, she beat the odds once again and went into complete remission. Jane Foster was cancer-free. And not a moment too soon, as not long after that, the war that the dark elf Malekith had been waging across the 10 realms finally came to Earth. Having finally saved her own life, Jane again joined the fight to save the Earth by picking up the shattered pieces of the War Thor's hammer, which came together in her hands. Changing into her Thor form one final time, Jane Foster joined Thor Odinson, as well as the time-displaced Thors that previously helped him defeat the God Butcher, and together the 4 Thors fought in the final battle of the War of the Realms. During that battle, Mjolnir was reforged and reclaimed by the Odinson, but at its end the hammer of the War Thor shattered. However, instead of disappearing into nothingness, that weapon from another universe transformed, joining with Jane and becoming Underjarn, the All-Weapon. While she no longer possessed the power of Thor, this new weapon could form into any shape that she needed, and it seems she would need it soon. During the War of the Realms, the Valkyrie were slain, and without them, none could enter the fabled halls of Valhalla. And so the spirit of the Valkyrie, Brunhilde, appeared before Dr. Jane Foster and asked if she would take up this sacred duty. And thus, with new powers and a new purpose, Dr. Jane Foster became the Valkyrie. And so her story continues. And if you want to know what happens next, you can read her 2019 solo series, Jane Foster, Valkyrie. But, of course, that's all I've got for you this week, and thank you so much for watching this video. If you enjoyed it, please leave a like, share the video, and subscribe for more marvelous content. Be sure to leave a comment letting me know what Marvel hero or villain you'd like to hear about next, and as always, the issues referenced in this video are listed in the description below, as well as links to other places you can find me, including my Patreon page, where for only $1 a month you can get your name in these special thanks here. So until next time, true believers, Excelsior!